Missing persons. Bloodstains. Stories no one wanted to believe. Behind every police report is a human tragedy, and in these cases, the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. Let's retrace the steps that led to terrifying discoveries. Katrina Wright's brow was originally from Germany. There, she met an American serviceman named Charles, and they fell in love and got married. After their wedding, Charles brought Katrina to the United States, where they settled in a small town called Ayer, Massachusetts, which had around 5,000 residents. Together, they had 2 children, a son and a daughter. After leaving the military, Charles worked at a local factory that made knives and surgical instruments, providing for the family while Katrina stayed at home as a housewife. Katrina and Charles enjoyed a long life together filled with happy moments. As their children grew up and started their own lives, Katrina remained active, social, and energetic. When her children visited on weekends, she joyfully danced and had fun with her daughter. It was often hard to find her at home. In contrast, Charles was quiet, reserved, and calm. In 1980, Katrina was on the verge of realizing her long-held dream. She wanted to return to Germany to see how her home country had changed and to visit relatives and friends with whom she had kept in touch through letters over the years. To make this trip possible, she saved money for a long time but was so anxious about the possibility of her savings being stolen that she carried a large amount of cash in an envelope with her everywhere she went. This included outings to local restaurants with friends and family. When they learned about her money-carrying habit, they were surprised and often questioned her reasoning. It seemed odd to them that Katrina wasn't afraid to walk around with so much cash, especially since it posed a risk to her safety. However, Katrina believed that leaving the money at home unattended was even riskier. She felt that if she kept cash, her travel savings would be safe. At 48 years old, she truly thought her concerns were unfounded, at least until May 21, 1980. On that day, as usual, Charles left for work around 7 a.m., while Katrina stayed home a bit longer before heading to her job. However, by 10 a.m., her colleagues began to worry because she had not arrived at work. This was unusual for her. They attempted to call her, but she didn't answer. They also couldn't reach Charles, as he was out of contact during his shift, and mobile phones had not yet been invented. To save time, her colleagues began contacting the couple's closest relatives whose phone numbers they had. They were able to reach the daughter-in-law who lived next door to Katrina. She agreed to check on Katrina. At 10:45, she went to the address. She knocked on the door and windows several times, but there was no response. Her calls went unanswered, and the windows were tightly covered. When she tried to get inside, she found the front door was unlocked. As soon as she opened the door, it was clear that a struggle had occurred in the house. In the kitchen, she found Katrina lying on the floor, bleeding and unresponsive. The room showed signs of a violent confrontation, with furniture, appliances, and books scattered all around. The sink was soaked with water and blood, creating a horrifying scene. The daughter-in-law immediately called 911 for help, hoping that Katrina could be saved. However, she was too scared to remain in the house and waited for emergency responders outside. Paramedics quickly arrived at the house but were unable to save Katrina, who had already died. Detectives were immediately on the scene to investigate the crime. It became clear that the likely killer knew Katrina, as evidenced by the violence of the attack and the fact that the windows and locks were undamaged. This suggested that Katrina either let the attacker in willingly or he had a key. The assault took place in the kitchen, where the attacker used water to wash something in the sink, likely his hands or face. The kitchen remained messy, with blood and water splattered around. A faint fingerprint was discovered on the screen, while a clearer print was found on a toaster lying on the floor. Additionally, several hairs were found clutched in Katrina's fist, likely pulled from the attacker during a struggle. Unfortunately, DNA analysis techniques were still in their infancy at that time, so investigators could only collect and store the evidence for future analysis. Forensic scientists focused on the fingerprints they found. An expert determined that Katrina had been attacked multiple times. The suspected murder weapon, a paring knife, was discovered in the trash under the sink. The murder occurred in the kitchen, and it was clear that the house had been ransacked. The victim, Katrina, had her jewelry stolen, along with an envelope containing money she had saved for a trip back to her homeland. Initially, law enforcement believed the motive behind the crime was the stolen money. However, Katrina was determined to keep her savings, which led her to fight back against the robber, resulting in her tragic death. The numerous stab wounds also suggested a possible personal motive. Investigators looked into Katrina's personal life but found no one who could commit such a violent act. She did not have any obvious enemies and was not vocal about having money in her home, with only her closest friends knowing about her savings. This limited circle led them to suspect her husband, Charles. They theorized that the murder might have taken place before he left for work around 7 a.m. Evidence linked the murder weapon, a knife, to Charles, as it was produced by the company where he worked. He acknowledged that this knife was often used in their kitchen. While many residents owned similar knives, the knife in question had been thoroughly cleaned, which raised suspicions. During the interrogation, Charles expressed deep sorrow over his wife's death. He had been married to her for decades and appeared genuinely grief-stricken. Still, the fact that the perpetrator used a kitchen knife instead of a premeditated weapon was unusual for such a crime. Despite his apparent distress, Charles was subjected to a polygraph test, which he passed. In addition to the numerous stab wounds, Katrina had suffered a blow to the head from a blunt object, likely a lamp found broken near her body in the kitchen. Ultimately, with the collection of fingerprints and blood samples from the scene and after questioning Charles, the police decided to send him home. From the beginning, he was hesitant to go home because it reminded him of the tragedy. In 1980, there were no specialized companies for crime scene cleanup, so he had to rely on his relatives for assistance. Consequently, Katrina's daughter and daughter-in-law ended up cleaning the kitchen and removing blood from various surfaces. They also expressed their concerns to the authorities, who believed that Katrina's attacker might have been someone she knew personally. To understand what happened, they explored various possibilities. During their conversations, they recalled a 25-year-old man named Kenneth Waters. Born on August 16, 1953, Kenneth was 26 at the time of the crime. He comes from a large, troubled family. He lives near Katrina, and some of his relatives are facing legal troubles. Kenneth himself had a history of minor criminal offenses. Before reaching adulthood, he had been arrested for participating in a knife fight. Since it was his first offense, he received a fine and was required to perform community service. A few weeks prior to Katrina's death, Kenneth had attacked law enforcement officers. Although a trial was scheduled for the day she was murdered, he was released on bail beforehand. Kenneth worked as a cook at a restaurant that Katrina frequently visited to spend time with her friends and family. While she did not interact with him directly, he might have learned about her possessing a large sum of money, possibly by overhearing her conversations during his shifts. Katrina's daughter and daughter-in-law informed the police of their suspicions regarding him. Law enforcement officers decided to investigate Kenneth as a potential suspect in the murder. They spoke with him, but he denied any involvement and did not show any typical signs of a murderer. However, his previous involvement in a knife fight raised suspicions against him. When the police interviewed Kenneth again, he provided a solid alibi, supported by documentation. He had a time card that clearly indicated the hours he worked at the restaurant, which confirmed his statement. His colleagues, who were on duty with him that night, also verified his alibi. Kenneth explained that he left home the night before at 10 p.m., worked the night shift, and did not leave the restaurant until around 9 a.m. the next morning. A friend drove him back home, where his girlfriend could also confirm his presence. He did not stay long at home. He quickly changed clothes, took a shower, and left. By 10 a.m., he was attending a court hearing related to an incident involving a police officer. Given his tight schedule, he simply did not have the opportunity to commit the crime before his court appearance. Kenneth dressed neatly and left for court, where he remained until 11 a.m. afterward. He returned to the restaurant and stayed there until 12:30 p.m. When he got home, he encountered the police, who were canvassing the neighborhood. They spoke with him, examined his clothes and body for any blood or scratches, finding none, which did not raise any suspicion. A forensic expert determined that the murder occurred around 7 a.m., likely soon after her husband Charles left for work. Detectives believed the crime could have taken place between 7 and 10:45 a.m., when the body was discovered. Given the limited time Kenneth had before the trial, it seemed unlikely that he could have committed the crime and escaped unnoticed. After verifying Kenneth's alibi, he was removed from the list of suspects due to a lack of evidence of criminal activity. However, investigators did not completely rule him out of the investigation as the case progressed, though they did not find any new evidence. Fingerprints retrieved from the crime scene did not match any in existing databases, which were not very advanced at that time. The investigation stalled for 2 years with little to no progress. During this time, a man named Robert Osborne contacted the police, claiming he had important information regarding Catherine's murder. However, he expected to receive a reward for his testimony. Detectives indicated that a reward could only be offered to someone providing valuable information that led to an arrest. Robert suggested that law enforcement should interview Kenneth's ex-girlfriend, Brenda Marsh. At the time of the call, Robert was dating Brenda and was familiar with Kenneth's situation. He claimed that Kenneth had confessed to the murder during a private conversation. By the time the police received this tip, Brenda had already broken up with Kenneth, who was living elsewhere. Brenda confirmed that at the time of Katrina's murder, she and Kenneth were living together. She described Kenneth as rude and cruel. Brenda had a daughter with him, and they were struggling financially. Following the advice of Robert, her new boyfriend, she decided to turn Kenneth in, hoping to receive a reward that would help her situation. According to Brenda, on the evening of May 20, 1980, Kenneth left their home around 10 p.m. to go to work at a restaurant. However, when they called the restaurant later, they found out that Kenneth had not arrived there at the expected time. Brenda was uncertain about what time Kenneth returned home or whether he had gone to the restaurant at all. The next morning, he came back with a deep, fresh scratch on his face that was still bleeding. When Brenda asked him about it, he replied that it was none of her business. He quickly changed his clothes, took a shower, and left for a court appointment. When Kenneth returned from court regarding an assault case, Brenda informed him that the police were already investigating at their home. Kenneth was very upset about this and told Brenda that if the police asked her about him, she should say he hadn't lived there for about a month. After the investigation stalled, they relocated and waited a bit to avoid drawing attention to their escape. Brenda attempted to inquire about the incident with Kenneth, but he brushed off her concerns, stating that it was none of her business. However, one night, while drunk, he revealed that he had interacted with a German woman to take her money. Kenneth's testimony was contradicted by his time card, which showed he arrived at work on time and left only at 9 a.m. Brenda's statements also conflicted with the fact that Kenneth spoke to the police when he returned home and had no visible scratches on his face. Brenda's suspicions seemed unfounded. She could simply be a scorned ex seeking revenge on Kenneth. To clarify the situation, she was offered a polygraph test, which she took and passed. The detectives then decided to conduct a further investigation into Kenneth's background. They found another ex-girlfriend who claimed that Kenneth had also confessed to murdering a German woman, whom he referred to casually. Despite this new testimony, there was still little evidence against him. The fingerprints found on the toaster and faucet in the kitchen where Katrina died did not match Kenneth. This investigation took place in 1982, before DNA testing was available. To eliminate any doubts, they compared Kenneth's blood type with the blood found at the scene, and they matched it. The detectives viewed this as solid evidence of Kenneth's guilt, despite the low accuracy of such comparisons. It appeared that the prosecutor was eager to close the case quickly and needed someone to blame. Given the personal nature of the crime and its brutality, the police decided to thoroughly search for a possible motive. Kenneth had a difficult childhood that significantly shaped his life. He harbored a long-standing dislike for Katrina, feeling resentful towards her and her children. They all grew up together, and Katrina's children often boasted about their pocket money, which upset Kenneth because his family struggled financially. One day, driven by frustration, Kenneth and his sister broke into Katrina's house, stealing sweets and money from her children's piggy bank. At that time, Kenneth was only 10 years old. Katrina was understandably furious and insisted on taking action against him for his unacceptable behavior. Then, Kenneth was taken from his family and placed in a juvenile correctional facility at age 10. There, he faced harsh conditions alongside older teens who had committed more serious offenses. Kenneth found this experience traumatic and rarely spoke about it, yet he held a deep resentment towards Katrina for her role in his imprisonment. Despite the hostility he faced from others, his sister, Betty Ann, supported him. Although she was younger, Betty was very close to Kenneth and always believed he was innocent. Despite Betty's support, Kenneth was arrested 2 years after Katrina's tragic death and charged with her murder. The hearing was set for 1983. Kenneth remained calm about the upcoming trial, confident in his alibi, which was supported by a timesheet. However, from the very beginning, the odds were stacked against him. His former girlfriend, Brenda, testified against him, sharing even more information than before. She claimed to have been in close contact with a friend of Katrina's who had previously dated Kenneth. Catherine's friend stated that Kenneth had given her a ring a few months after Catherine's death. Upon seeing the ring, Brenda realized it resembled one she had seen on Katrina before the murder. Photos of the ring were presented as evidence during the trial. The prosecution utilized clever tactics and presented various pieces of circumstantial evidence. Kenneth's lawyer believed he had a good chance of avoiding a conviction and advised him not to testify in his own defense. However, when it was time to present evidence of Kenneth's innocence, the timesheet had mysteriously disappeared. Without it, and relying only on his family's claims that he was a good person, there was no substantial proof to support his innocence. Consequently, Kenneth Waters was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defense argued that Kenneth was fortunate that the state did not have the death penalty, otherwise, he would have faced execution. Kenneth maintained his innocence and requested a retrial, but only his sister Betty supported him. Others believed she was too emotionally attached and forgave him for his past mistakes. His history of wrongdoings influenced the jury's decision against him. Initially, his lawyer believed in his innocence and worked diligently to exonerate him. However, all appeals were denied. As time passed, the lawyer's enthusiasm dwindled. Kenneth lost the opportunity to have his case reconsidered and was left to serve a life sentence in prison. His family believed his imprisonment was due to his lack of financial resources. He could not afford a skilled lawyer. After all his appeals were turned down, no attorney wanted to take on his case. Kenneth accepted his fate, but Betty remained determined. She frequently visited him in prison and continued to believe in his innocence, steadfastly pursuing justice on his behalf. Kenneth had a difficult personality and frequently caused problems in prison, which made it hard for anyone to make excuses for his behavior. He even tried to end his life out of despair. During one visit, Betty was unable to see him because he was in solitary confinement after getting into a fight with another inmate. Once he was released from solitary, they were able to meet, and Betty had a heartfelt conversation with him, expressing her determination to help him get out of prison. Their trust in lawyers had faded, especially since many refused to take on Kenneth's case. Betty felt she could only rely on herself. At that time, she hadn't completed high school and lacked the necessary education. She had also divorced her husband, who had discouraged her from helping Kenneth. As a single mother of 2, she worked as a waitress, struggling to support herself and her children, but she remained committed to helping Kenneth. Betty first focused on finishing high school and then enrolled in college. She managed to balance her night shifts as a waitress while raising her kids. Despite the challenges, her determination and strong feelings propelled her forward. Betty eventually became a lawyer, fully knowledgeable about Kenneth's case but puzzled about how his timesheet went missing. Additionally, she discovered that Brenda, who reported a large scratch on Kenneth's face the day Katrina was murdered, had lied, as Kenneth had been in court, then at a restaurant, and later speaking with detectives. Those reports did not mention any injuries on Kenneth. It was odd that no one else noticed the scratch. Detectives typically pay close attention to such details, especially since Kenneth was one of the suspects from the beginning. Betty continuously reviewed the evidence and found substantial confirmation of her suspicions. Furthermore, she learned that Brenda did not actually take a polygraph test. Instead, Brenda only passed a voice test, which can indicate lies but is less reliable than a polygraph. Kenneth successfully passed the lie detector test, which should have worked in his favor, but this detail was not mentioned during the trial. As Betty investigated the circumstances surrounding Kenneth's conviction, she increasingly realized that law enforcement had seemingly chosen him as a scapegoat. Brenda went to the police after realizing that Kenneth had received a life sentence and admitted that she had lied under pressure from Robert, who hoped to gain financially. She also desired revenge on her ex, Kenneth, and felt pressured by the police. Now, she regretted that her actions had led to an innocent man being imprisoned for life. Another ex-girlfriend also revealed that she testified against Kenneth due to pressure from a female police officer who had a personal bias against him and was intent on seeing him convicted. It wasn't until 1999 that Betty gained access to significant evidence, specifically DNA samples collected from the crime scene. She uncovered a box of documents and samples, including blood and hair, that had never been analyzed before. The examination revealed that the DNA from the crime scene did not match Kenneth's. However, both law enforcement and the public worked to prevent the case from being reopened, while Katrina's family strongly resisted any new investigation. In 2000, Betty successfully reached out to the Innocence Project, a group of lawyers dedicated to assisting wrongfully convicted individuals. This organization had a team of experts and the resources needed to conduct thorough investigations. Betty presented evidence proving Kenneth's innocence, convincing the project to take on his case. She also contacted a female police officer involved in the investigation, who had a questionable reputation and had previously compromised her credibility in another case. Many in law enforcement spoke poorly of her, raising suspicions that she had intentionally framed Kenneth and had not lost key evidence by chance. Furthermore, inconsistencies in the testimonies of Kenneth's former girlfriends were exposed, particularly regarding a ring that was shown to the jury. It was discovered that the ring had been sent to Germany and did not match the jewelry owned by Kenneth's ex-girlfriend. It was smaller and unsuitable for Katrina. Betty sought to find the ring to counter another piece of evidence against Kenneth. She learned that the ring had initials engraved on it that did not belong to Katrina. Ultimately, due to Betty's extensive efforts in uncovering these discrepancies, the case was reopened, and the prosecutor dropped the charges against Kenneth. After spending 18 years, 5 months, and 10 days in prison, Kenneth was finally acquitted and became a free man. He was able to enjoy life again after being deprived of it for so long. Unfortunately, tragedy struck. On September 19, 2001, while visiting his brother's house, Kenneth decided to take a shortcut that required him to climb over a tall wall. He did not realize the wall on the other side was even higher. When he jumped from a height of 15 feet, he fell awkwardly, struck his head, and later died in the hospital. Betty, Kenneth's sister, remembered that those 6 months after his release were the happiest of his life. After so many years in prison, everything felt new to him. Even after his death, Betty continued to fight for justice. In 2004, she filed a lawsuit against the city for the wrongful imprisonment of Kenneth and the impact it had on their lives. By 2009, she successfully won the case, receiving $10.5 million in compensation. In this story, Katrina's murder case remains unsolved and often forgotten. The blood found at the crime scene was tested, but no matches were found in the police database. The identity of the person who brutally took her life remains unknown. Her family hopes that one day, the case will be solved.